In the autumn of 1908, a structural engineer named Edmund Hargrove climbed to the roof of the Holbrook Municipal Building in Albany, New York, carrying a hand level, a leather-bound field notebook, and a brass transit compass that had belonged to his father. The building had been constructed in 1871. It had stood for 37 years, and in that time, no licensed engineer had ever been permitted above the 5th floor. Hargrove had been hired to assess a crack in the eastern cornice, a minor structural complaint, the kind of job that normally took an afternoon. He came back down 6 hours later. He had filled 22 pages of his field notebook. His hands were shaking. When his assistant asked what he had found, Hargrove said nothing for a long moment. Then he said this: the roof was not a roof. And then he said the second thing, the thing that got him fired 3 weeks later and had his professional license quietly suspended by the state of New York within the year. He said the spires on that building were not decorative. They had never been decorative, and someone had gone to considerable effort to make sure no one ever looked closely at what they actually were. The official record of Edmund Hargrove's dismissal from the Albany Public Works contract describes the termination as a routine budget reduction. The reason given was a reallocation of municipal funds following the panic of 1907. But here is what those official records do not mention. Hargrove was not dismissed from just one contract. Within 14 days of his rooftop inspection, he was removed from 4 separate active city commissions, all of them unrelated to the Holbrook building, all of them severed without the standard 30-day notice required under New York municipal contract law. He was not an unstable man. He was not given to theories or speculation. He was a German-trained structural engineer who had certified the load-bearing integrity of more than 180 buildings across New England over a 16-year career. He had no documented complaints, no financial irregularities, and no professional disputes on record before the autumn of 1908. Within 6 months of his rooftop inspection, he had lost every municipal contract he held. Within 2 years, he had relocated to rural Vermont and never submitted another professional filing in his name again. His field notebook from that afternoon was not among his personal effects when he died in 1931. His family has no record of what happened to it. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what Hargrove found on that rooftop, you have to go back, not just to 1871 when the Holbrook building was constructed. You have to go back to a period that architectural historians have spent the better part of a century quietly avoiding. Between roughly 1850 and 1890, a wave of municipal construction swept across every major American city. The official explanation for this building boom is the one taught in every university program: industrialization, population growth, the expansion of civic government. Railroads moved materials. Factories produced brick and iron in volumes that had never before been possible. Cities needed courthouses, post offices, train stations, water authority buildings, and municipal halls. The story is simple, linear, and almost entirely incomplete. Because the engineers who built these structures, not the architects, not the city planners, but the men who actually specified the materials and fabricated the components, left behind a paper record that tells a different story. A story that the official history does not address and, in several documented cases, has actively worked to ensure you never read. What the textbooks do not address is this: the buildings constructed during this period share a set of architectural features that have no functional explanation under the official account. Rooftop spires, metal finials, copper-clad towers, elaborate pinnacles set at precise geometric intervals along ridgelines, dome-capping rods. The standard academic answer is that these were decorative, expressions of civic pride, imitations of European cathedral architecture, the aesthetic preferences of Beaux-Arts and Second Empire designers. That explanation has been repeated so many times that it has acquired the weight of settled fact. But there is a detail in the physical specifications of these structures that the decorative explanation cannot account for. The spires were hollow, not all of them, but the most significant ones, the tallest, the most prominently positioned, the ones fabricated from copper rather than iron, were hollow, with interior channels that ran from the apex downward through the shaft and terminated at connection points inside the attic space of the buildings they crowned. Hollow decorations are unusual. Hollow decorations with interior channels that terminate at connection points inside a building are not decorations at all. They are components of a system. There is a growing body of independent research suggesting that the official history of American civic construction, particularly between 1855 and 1895, is missing entire chapters that credentialed architectural historians have repeatedly declined to engage with. Buildings visible in photographic records from the 1870s show roof lines dramatically different from the same buildings photographed after 1910. The copper spires are gone. The hollow shaft finials have been replaced with plain iron caps or removed outright. The standard institutional explanation is that aging decorative metalwork was simply replaced as maintenance costs rose and fashions changed. But that explanation does not survive contact with the timeline. Decorative fashions change gradually across generations. What happened to these rooftop structures was not gradual. In city after city, across a period of roughly 15 years between 1895 and 1912, the rooflines of the most significant civic buildings in America were systematically stripped. Not all of them. Not randomly. The buildings that retained their original rooftop metalwork tended to be privately owned. The buildings whose spires and copper finials disappeared tended to be government property. That is a specific pattern. It is not the pattern of changing taste. To understand why this matters, why the material and the hollow construction and the placement at precise geometric intervals along roof lines matters, you need to know something about what else was happening in America during those same decades. The 1870s and 1880s were not simply a period of industrial expansion. They were a period of intense and largely forgotten experimentation with atmospheric energy. Researchers and inventors across the country were filing patents and submitting papers on the question of whether the atmosphere itself could serve as a medium for the transmission and collection of energy. Most of these men are not in any textbook. Their work was not suppressed in any dramatic single event. It was marginalized slowly, paper by paper, over 2 generations, as the energy infrastructure we now take for granted was built by interests that had every financial reason to ensure no alternative ever became viable. The buildings going up in American cities during this exact period were being designed by architects, but the rooftop metalwork on those buildings was being specified by engineers who were in conversation. Through professional societies, through correspondence, through shared suppliers, with the very researchers asking those atmospheric questions. That context does not prove anything on its own, but it makes the word receivers considerably harder to dismiss. A man named Cyrus Alderton was a foundry foreman in Philadelphia who supervised the fabrication and installation of rooftop metalwork on at least 31 municipal buildings between 1862 and 1889. He kept a production ledger, a bound volume, 214 pages, with hand-drawn specifications and material notations for every commission he fulfilled. That was donated to the Philadelphia Athenaeum by his grandson in 1953. The Athenaeum cataloged it. For 11 years, it was accessible to researchers. In 1964, the catalog entry was amended to read, "Removed for conservation." The ledger has not been available to the public since. The conservation process, according to Athenaeum records, was never completed. What Alderton's ledger contained, according to two researchers who examined it before 1964 and whose notes do survive, were specifications for rooftop installations that Alderton himself described as receivers. Not spires, not finials. Receivers. The word appears, according to those surviving research notes, more than 40 times across the ledger's pages. And Alderton was not a man prone to imprecise language. His surviving professional correspondence, held at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, shows a careful and methodical mind. He used the word he meant. He called them receivers because that is what they were. Receivers for what, precisely, Alderton never spelled out in the ledger itself. But the specifications he recorded are detailed enough to be instructive on their own terms. The metalwork he fabricated was not solid. It was hollow, with interior channels running from the apex of each spire down through the shaft, terminating at a junction point inside the building's attic space. The material was not chosen for appearance. Alderton specified copper for its conductivity. He specified bronze for longevity and weather exposure. He specified iron only where structural load required it, and he noted in multiple entries that iron was a poor substitute for the intended function. The intended function. Those three words appear in his ledger as a phrase, not the decorative purpose, not the aesthetic requirement, the intended function. A foundry foreman in 1880 did not accidentally use the language of engineering when he meant to write the language of ornament. This is where the account of Edmund Hargrove connects to something much larger than one building in Albany. The Holbrook Municipal Building was not unique. In 1908, the same year Hargrove made his inspection, a structural survey was conducted on the Cleveland City Hall by a team of engineers hired to assess water infiltration damage in the upper floors. Their report, filed with the Cuyahoga County Records Office in February 1909, contains a section on rooftop metalwork that runs to 11 pages. Those 11 pages were not included in the publicly circulated version of the report. They were filed separately, under a municipal reference number that does not correspond to any standard Cleveland Records classification system used before or after 1909. A researcher named Deborah Klein spent 4 years attempting to locate that filing while working on her dissertation at Case Western Reserve University in the early 1980s. She found the reference number in the index. She never found the pages it referenced. But here is what makes this case different from every other account of suppressed architectural history. A retired municipal archivist in Cincinnati, a man named Howard Bassett, who had spent 31 years in city records management before his retirement in 1994, came forward in 1998 with a specific and detailed account. He described processing, during the 1970s, a sealed box of pre-1910 renovation documents for city-owned buildings. Inside that box, he said, were maintenance logs for rooftop metalwork on 4 Cincinnati civic buildings. Each log contained a column he had never seen before or since in 31 years of records work. The column header, handwritten, read, "Discharge interval." Discharge interval, not maintenance interval. Not inspection interval, discharge interval. Bassett made a copy of 1 page before the box was transferred to a federal liaison office he had no name for and never heard from again. The copy was in his possession until a house fire in 2003 destroyed it along with most of his personal files. If Howard Bassett was fabricating this account, he fabricated it at the age of 71, with no book to sell and no audience to perform for. He told it once, to a small Ohio historical newsletter with a circulation under 400 people, and was never publicly interviewed about it again. Chicago, 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition opens. More than 200 major buildings constructed on the fairgrounds, many of them featuring elaborate rooftop metalwork. Photographs taken during the fair show spires, rods, and copper finials on virtually every significant structure. Photographs taken of the same buildings during their demolition in 1894 show the rooftop metalwork removed before the walls came down. The scrap records for the fair demolition do not account for the volume of copper that should have been recovered. Thousands of pounds simply do not appear in the salvage logs. St. Louis, 1901, the old post office building undergoes a partial renovation. Workers removing the cornice on the northern face report, finding hollow interior channels in 3 of the 5 rooftop ornamental towers. The foreman files a notation in the job log. The notation is crossed out. The crossing out appears in a different ink. Buffalo, 1904, the Temple of Music is demolished. The salvage team foreman submits a written request to City Records asking for the original construction specifications for the rooftop ironwork. The request is denied on the grounds that the specifications are held by a private architectural firm. The firm named in the denial had dissolved in 1887. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. The institutional response to researchers who have attempted to document this pattern has been consistent and, in its consistency, deeply revealing. The Smithsonian's Division of Engineering and Industry received a formal research inquiry in 1971 from a historian named Wallace Prout, who was requesting access to pre-1900 civic construction archives related to electrical and atmospheric instrumentation on public buildings. The Smithsonian's response, dated March 14, 1971, informed Prout that the materials he was seeking were not held in their collection. Prout had already confirmed through separate correspondence with the Smithsonian's own catalog department that 14 specific items he was requesting were in fact listed in their holdings. The division's response did not acknowledge this discrepancy. Prout wrote back 3 times. He received no further reply. He died in 1979. His research files were acquired by a private collector and have not been made publicly available. The Smithsonian has never adequately explained why its Division of Engineering and Industry maintains active catalog entries for materials that its own staff simultaneously denies possessing. It has never explained why the photographic archives of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, held at the Library of Congress, contain 34 images listed in the catalog index that are not present in the physical collection. It has never explained why rooftop renovation permits filed in New York City between 1905 and 1915, a decade of intensive municipal modification to exactly the class of buildings under discussion, were transferred from the city's Department of Buildings to a federal jurisdiction that no longer exists and whose records were never folded into any surviving federal archive. Why would any institution spend the administrative effort to quietly remove decorative architectural features from public buildings if they were, in fact, merely decorative? Why would salvage records for copper metalwork consistently show shortfalls, not overages, not normal accounting variance, but the same directional shortfall across multiple cities and multiple decades? Why would a foundry foreman's professional ledger, cataloged and accessible for 11 years, be pulled from public access for a conservation process that was never completed and never mentioned again? Why would the column in a municipal maintenance log read discharge interval if what was being maintained was an ornament? These questions do not go away because institutions refuse to answer them. For the 11 years following his dismissal, Edmund Hargrove attempted to interest 3 separate engineering associations in his Holbrook findings. He wrote to the American Society of Civil Engineers in 1909. He received a form letter. He approached an editor at Engineering News in 1912 with a written summary of his rooftop observations. The editor agreed to meet with him. After the meeting, the editor sent a short note declining to publish, offering no explanation whatsoever. In 1919, Hargrove wrote a 40-page private document, not a formal submission, but a personal record, which he gave to his son-in-law, a schoolteacher named Robert Finch, with instructions to keep it until someone came asking. No one came asking during Robert Finch's lifetime. When Finch died in 1961, his daughter spoke to a local Vermont Historical Society volunteer in 1987 and recalled that her father had kept a sealed envelope in the bottom drawer of his desk for his entire adult life. He had told her never to open it unless a specific kind of person came asking for it. She could not remember what kind of person her father had described. The envelope was not among his belongings when he died. She assumed it had been discarded with other papers. She did not sound entirely certain of that. The Holbrook Municipal Building still stands in Albany today, renamed twice and significantly altered at ground level. In photographs taken between 1871 and approximately 1912, you can count 7 rooftop spires along the ridgeline, plus 4 corner finials, each fabricated in copper, with a hollow shaft clearly visible in the 2 photographs taken during a documented 1903 cornice repair reported in the Albany Evening Journal. In photographs taken after 1915, the ridgeline is plain. The spires are gone. The city's permit records for any rooftop modification between 1908 and 1920 contain no entry for the Holbrook building. The work was done, the permits were never filed. And if the internal architecture was not fully gutted during the 1960s renovation, the junction points where Alderton's hollow copper channels once terminated are still somewhere inside that building, sealed or plastered over, or simply sitting in the dark of an attic space that no licensed engineer has had cause to inspect in more than a century. The official history of American civic architecture tells us that rooftop spires were decorative features of a passing era, removed as taste shifted and maintenance budgets tightened. What the foundry ledgers, the engineering notations, the archived discharge logs, the missing 11 pages from Cleveland, and the sealed research files of Wallace Prout tell us is that something with an intended function was built into the rooflines of American cities during a very specific window of time, and that the systematic removal of that something was not random, not gradual, and has never been explained by anyone with the authority to explain it. You have been looking at these buildings your entire life. Most people never think to look up. These records survive because people refuse to stop searching for them. Subscribe and share this with someone who still asks the right questions. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week, I am pulling a thread that connects what was removed from these rooftops to a network of patents filed between 1872 and 1901, patents whose inventors share one specific and deeply strange detail. Every single one of them was visited by federal agents within 3 years of filing. A patent examiner named Samuel Dodd. 1889. You will not want to miss it.